Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. This video is going to cover the prompt of the second exploratory draft for the How Does a Poet Make a Meaning essay. This is your video recording draft, and though that might be scary, this is an opportunity to explain and analyze a poem in a new way for you. And this doesn't need to be perfect, it doesn't need to be perfectly polished, but it just needs to be you pressing into a poem and trying to make the most sense of it. It's practice analysis. It's not the polished analysis we'll have in the final draft of the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay just yet. But I want you to do the best you can with it. And this video is going to give you an example of what it might look like to do so. And just one example though, you can take different forms, different approaches to the video if you'd like. I'm just going to show you how you could go about your video for the How Does a Poet Make Meaning Exploratory Draft 2. So I'm going to turn to a document that has the prompt on it and then also a poem that I'm going to read and analyze for you as an example. We'll get there in a minute. Let's read the prompt. So let's pick a poem from our poetry packet and present your analysis of it to me in a recorded video. Keep the tone casual and informational, as if you're explaining the poem to a friend. Your goal is to explain how the poet creates meaning in this specific poem, which means you need to make a claim about what the meaning, message, or argument of the poem is, and then explain how the poet creates that meaning, message, or argument. Make sure you point out specific passages or elements from the poem as evidence for your claims. And you can refer to the Anteater Guide for Writing and Rhetoric chapter called Practicing Critical Reading for guidance. The video needs to be 10 minutes long. You'll start by reading the poem and then go straight into your analysis. So I'm going to read the poem and then I'm going to do an analysis for you. But then I'll explain the way I structured the video and how there are alternatives to how you structure and go about presenting your analysis, just so you see some options. This is a poem by a poet, Charles Wright. He was actually the first creative writing professor at UCI 50 years ago, one of my favorite poets. This is his poem called The Appalachian Book of the Dead. It's fairly long. It's this whole page right here, probably middle between the kind of poems we've read. And it's not easy, I'll tell you that. It's a difficult poem to understand. And I actually chose this because seeing its difficulty, a reader needs to fully understand how these technical skills a poet uses to make meaning are on display in order to ground the reader and give them a sense of what this poem is about. So as I read it, you might be completely lost and confused. But then I'm going to walk back through the poem with you, look at some of these underlined sections that I've made already in advance, and talk about how those represent the technical skills and the response of a reader to these technical skills and how that generates some argument in this poem or some message. Remember, we always ask, what does this poem value? And that might be one way to say what its meaning is. So let me read this first, and then we'll dive right into the analysis. The Appalachian Book of the Dead. Sunday, September Sunday. Outdoors like an early page from the Appalachian Book of the Dead. Sunlight lavishes brilliance on every surface. Doves settle surreptitious angels on tree limb and box branch. A crow calls deep in its own darkness. Something like water ticks on just there, beyond the horizon, just there. Steady clock. Go in fear of abstractions. Well, possibly. Meanwhile, they are the strata our bodies rise through, the sear veins our skins rub off on. For instance, whatever enlightenment there might be housels compassion and affection, those two tributaries that river above our lives, whose waters we sense the sense of late at night, and later still. Uneasy, suburbanized, I drift from the lawn chair to the back porch, to the dwarf orchard, testing the grass in border garden, a stillness, as in the passageways of paradise, bell jars the afternoon. Leaves like ex votos hang hard and shine under the endlessness of heaven. Such skeletal altars, such vacant sanctuary. It always amazes me how landscape recalibrates the stations of the dead, how what we see jack up the odd quotient of what we don't see, how God's breath reconstitutes our waking up and walking down. First glimpse of autumn, stretched tight and snicked, a bad facelift, flicks in and flicks out, a virtual reality. Time to begin the long division. So, there is a very clear message in this poem, a very clear value that the poet is trying to get us to see, but more than just see, to experience and to feel. Most of this message becomes clear at the end of the poem, specifically in the sequence of how phrases. And this metaphor of mathematics, long division, quotient, and even there's this reference to testing up here. But essentially, the argument of this poem, or the message of it, what this poem values, is that it looks at the way people see the world and experience the world. And it values people looking closely at their own experiences, at their own observations, and questioning them, and being inquisitive, and not just settling for what is comfortable or what feels good. There is a definite tension in this poem between order, having things neatly in order and understandable, and disorder, meaning chaotic and uncertain and not organized. And what the speaker of this poem is suggesting to us is that we as people, in the midst of a world that is genuinely and realistically chaotic, there's things that are constantly happening that are out of our control. A lot of us try to force and or create a sense of order by seeing what we want to see and ignoring what we don't want to see. Or just ignoring the possibility that there might be more to see. And so the speaker of this poem sees this tension in himself and then understands that by extension it's a tension that must be in the reader. And he wants to make sense of it. He isn't comfortable with just trying to make himself content, trying to comfort himself, trying to please himself, when there is more out there that might put that pleasure or that comfort into question. And that's what this poem values. And its message is to keep being inquisitive, keep trying to make sense of what might not make sense, keep trying to ask questions about alternatives to the way you see the world or experience the world. Because in doing so, we might just find out more and get a deeper understanding of the world around us in doing so. So, how did I make sense of this? So, I started here with the explanation of what this poem is about, what it values, and you might be saying to yourself, that makes no sense. How does this poem say that? Well, first and foremost, we know that poems suggest ideas and that they suggest feelings. They pretty much don't come out and say them. Now, again, this last stanza comes pretty close to directly saying it, but the rest of the poem doesn't. So I want to look at the other stanzas leading up to this last one and identify a number of the technical skills that poets use to make meaning at any given place in this poem, and how an understanding of all of them working together leads me towards this message. So I'm going to start with the first stanza, of course. And this first stanza is going to represent this idea of comfort and order. What we're going to see in this first stanza is a very picturesque scene. It's a scene that the speaker is very pleased with. There's a sense of excitement, and it's just really just enjoyable. It's almost like just stepping outside on a Sunday afternoon and just being like, oh, this is the best day. Look how beautiful it is. That's essentially what he's saying. He's saying it with images that suggest that idea, but that is what he's saying. But more so than the images, there is the language. And so I want to look at two things. I want to look at the syntax um, of this first stanza and then also the sound. So right there, those are two technical skills that poets use to make meaning. Sound generates meaning or an emotional response, and then syntax also generates meaning or an emotional response. So the first two that we have here, or not the first two, the first underline and then the last one of the stanza, these represent syntactical moves that tell me that the speaker is very content and very pleased with this setting that he is seeing. Both of them are appositives. Sunday, September Sunday. September Sunday is a modifier of the first Sunday. And then there, and then the modifier beyond the horizon, just there. Each of these represent this kind of contemplative, almost relaxed posture. And to a certain degree, this last one, just there, a sense of excitement. And we see in these two appositives, these syntactical moves, that the attitude and posture of the speaker is very relaxed. But then we also get this idea of how beautiful the scene is and how picturesque and pleasant it is by just looking at the sound of the language that's repeated. So the repetition of the R and the L. R's and L's are known as liquids. It means they kind of roll off the tongue. They're very beautiful, they're very easy, they're very relaxed. Your mouth doesn't have to make any harsh sounds to say R's and L's. And so we have a ton of them. I underline them, like, early, sunlight, lavish, brilliance, every surface, settle, surreptitious, angels, tree, limb, branch, crow, calls, darkness, like, water, so on and so forth. There's some more R's here in the last line that I didn't underline. So in this first stanza, we really establish this tone or this feeling that the writer is seeing something off of his back porch, and he really enjoys it. He's just finding it very pleasant. And that's how the first stanza ends. We have that experience as a reader. We respond to the emotional pull of that language and of those appositives, and we're in the same place he is. Well, we look at the second stanza and we see that he immediately changes his tone and calls that first stanza into question. So there's no more beautiful imagery or much beautiful repetition of sound. Instead, there is a question. There's a statement that starts with "go in fear of abstractions." Something that is abstract means something that's not concrete. And then he immediately calls that into question by saying, well, possibly. The rest of the stanza introduces a pretty abstract idea itself. It's talking about this idea of compassion and affection, these two forces in our lives as humans, and they are forces that we only really sense. We don't really know, we can't fully articulate them, but we know they're there. Again, there's a lack of concrete description in this stanza, and there's a lack of that certainty that the speaker had in the first stanza. And not only do we know that by the absence of the images, but we know that from the syntactically short sentence, well, possibly. In the midst of this uncertainty, though, in the midst of this kind of abstract idea that doesn't ground the reader in anything that they can really grasp to, the writer at least grounds us in some prepositional phrases, or at least some syntactical phrases that show us that he's trying to make sense of something. So he uses the time order transition, meanwhile, and then he uses a logical transition, for instance, to introduce an example. So even though this stanza really doesn't clarify the idea it's trying to suggest, other than this idea of compassion and affection being something we can sense, it grounds us in its syntax. And we know it's trying to make sense of this abstract idea that he hasn't fully worked out yet. We're going to see in the rest of the poem how he works it out. One thing to pick up here, though, is a reference to something in the first stanza. Something is not concrete. Something is uncertain. something like water. He doesn't know what it is. He can't really explain it. It's just something that he senses. It's this steady clock that he senses. And these are all metaphors because when we have abstract ideas, we try to ground them in physical details. And he tries with metaphor here, but he ends up going in the very beginning of the second stanza. Well, go in fear of abstraction. Something is an abstraction. I can't quite make sense of it. But then he says at the end of the stanza, these ideas, these abstract ideas of compassion and affection, we sense them, but we can't quite put our finger on them. We can't quite describe them. We try with metaphor, but we are kind of lacking certainty. So, first stanza grounds us in that, oh, yeah, this is a beautiful scene. Second stanza immediately calls that into question and says that actually there's things in our life that we can't make sense of and that we can only sense. He's going to pick up even more on this conflict in the next stanza. In stanza 3, we are going to look at diction choices to establish or change tone. Here in the second stanza, the tone is kind of that idea of trying to figure it out, trying to make sense of it, a little uncertain. In the first stanza, the tone is very pleasant and pleased. Well, this third stanza, it changes to be pretty negative, and as the first line of the stanza suggests, pretty uneasy. We just look at the language like uneasy, drift, dwarf, testing, jars of the afternoon, hang, hard, skeletal, vacant. The description of the afternoon has changed dramatically. He's looking at the same scene. He's literally just on his back porch on a September Sunday. And at first he saw it one way, very beautifully. And now, after he's thought about this kind of concept that there are things in our life that we can't quite make sense of, then he changes his description of the scene. He's still describing the leaves, he's still describing the lawn chair and the orchard, the garden that he's in, but he's describing it with language that changes the tone dramatically from praise to criticism, if you want to use the terms that we practiced in the style portfolio. So he's still in this place of being uncertain now, and he's really settled into it. This all comes together in the fourth stanza, specifically when the argument is more directly made, but how we should position ourselves in the middle of this tension between order and disorder, things we can make sense of, things we can't make sense of, comes to head. So he says, it always amazes me how landscape recalibrates the stations of the dead, how what we see jacks up the odd quotient of what we don't see. And this is the perfect example of what we see in the first and the third stanza. How what we see, that's what he saw first in the first stanza. He saw something and it made him feel a particular way. But he's also recognizing, by the time he comes back to the third stanza, that he wasn't seeing something. So seeing was a choice here in the first stanza. The way he saw the background was a choice of how he wanted to put it all together, how he wanted to make sense of it. But the things we see exclude what we don't see. And if we put two people in the same scene, we know that they would see different things. Their attention would be called to different things. Their mood would be different. I think that's what he's getting at here, that we as humans aren't right in what we see. But what we see offsets an understanding that there's someone else or possibly other things to see in that scene. How God's breath reconstitutes our waking up, walking up and walking down. And then again, he ends the poem with a very negative description of the scene that was once beautiful. First glimpse of autumn, stretched tight and snicked, a bad facelift, flicks in and flicks out, kind of like a television that's blurry or something like that. A virtual reality. So he's looking at the scene in a completely different way now. And he says, time to begin the long division. The long division is the difference between what's seen and what's not seen. He saw it one way, and then he's recognizing that he could see it another way, So he needs to unpack what's been observed and how he's responded to this scene to make sense of what the reality is as best he can. And so, again, this goes back to this argument about this poem not to be content with what we see on first glimpse and using it to comfort us or make us feel a particular way or support a way we think, support an ideal that we have. That he's suggesting in this poem that we need to press in to see beyond what we initially respond to see what else is there, to make sense of the world around us with a bit of diligence and with an inquisitive mind that's looking to discover something beyond what's immediately available on the surface. So that is the Appalachian Book of the Dead. We saw repetition of sound make sense and make meaning for us. We saw syntax make sense and make meaning for us. We saw diction choices to establish tone and attitude making sense of this poem. And then ultimately the main theme captured in some of the language, like something, abstractions, and what we sense and what we see. So that's an example of reading a poem, stating its meaning or its message that I have gathered in my analysis of it, and then walking the reader through the elements of the poem, the evidence of the poem that make that message known. I had to look at the technical skills. I couldn't just look at what the writer said because what he said didn't come off so clearly at times. I had to look at how he said it and how I'm responding to the ways he said it to make sense of this poem and what it means. You can do this different ways. You can read the poem in your video and then start breaking down the evidence that you see and the skills that you see and the emotional effects that you have as you read it, and ultimately use that to build up to a statement that says this poem is about. So that would be doing it the opposite way I did it. Instead of starting with the message, ending with the message. You can also copy and you can put your poem into a Word doc and screen share it with me. And you can have underlined some portions in advance, some portions that will be your evidence. You don't have to do that, but you can. And that's probably the two options that you have, with maybe a third with the underlining in advance. So pick your poem from our poetry packet. Let's see. Pick a poem from the poetry packet that you want to read and you want to analyze for me, and spend some time reading it, figuring it out before the video. You don't want to wing it because it's difficult with poems and with the technical skills that they use to understand them on first reading. But spend some time with it, look at these technical skills and how they're making meaning, and present your video analysis to me that way. So we will continue from here. I can't wait to watch these videos and move into the full draft of the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay soon. All right, bye.